Welcome everyone, and it is my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jakkie Cilliers. For most of you, you know who he is. He was formerly, he's given strict instructions not to read out the pedigree, but I have to say at least something. And that he was Executive Director of the Institute for Security Studies, and he is still on the Board of Trustees. And of course he's published many books and monographs and papers on a whole range of issues. Most of us working in the field of international relations and security studies are familiar with most of Jakkie's work. And presently he's escaped all the mundane managerial stuff, which he's been caught up with for years and years and years, and is doing work on South Africa and Africa's long-term future. I also have a very special relationship with Jakkie in that I met him in 1991, and he will probably tell you that that's in my revolutionary days, not in my passive, boring senior years. So we've come a long way, and Jakkie has been very instrumental, more so than he realized, in launching my career internationally. So a very special person for me to have here today. Reading his books, many of you probably haven't read his books, but it's so nice to pick up a book which is just readable, and it's thought-provoking and engaging, and I mean, I could hardly put it down, and it just, everything kind of just captured as he went through it. I mean, and for us, especially in the social sciences, he raises so many important issues that we deal with and try to understand, from power to patronage, corruption, to voting patterns, to race, class, population growth, not much on gender though, unemployment, education, inequality, crime, protest, rule of law, even fracking, just Cheryl, climate change, just to name but a few issues, which he then all captures in these various scenarios. So a real book which has got a solid historical overview, and which he then, all this he matches with current debates which are going on and feeds into the different trajectories which he's then looking at in terms of the future of South Africa. I'm not going to spend too much time, but just for those of you who, and he's going to expand on it in more detail now, is his first 3 chapters analyze Zuma's presidency and what this legacy means for the future of the country, the ANC and other main political parties. And then from chapters 5 and 7, then he moves on to discuss how these developments in terms of party politics tensions between what Jakkie calls traditionalists and reformists will affect key economic and development outcomes in the country. Chapter 6 looks at the effect of crime, violence and stability, how this is likely to influence investor confidence. And then chapter 9 focuses really on the different scenarios. But before I hand over to Jakkie, I also want to say something before I forget, and that he's got a very special relationship with our Department of Sociology, and has been his father's legacy. He was head of department, he was also dean in this faculty, and his legacy lives on through many of our students, which are recipients of the SP Cilliers Awards, which are very prestigious. I think some of our students are here, and we're SP Cilliers Award winner. Yes, you like part of the Over to you, Jakkie. You can start off then by I've prepared all these questions, and he said, no, Lindy, we don't do it in a structured way, and of course you like this structured. So we'll go with the flow, and we'll start off by just taking us through the various aspects of your book.
Okay, Lindy, thanks very much, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I grew up in Yonkazoo, just up the road. So I watched my dad work on this building when it was built. So what I thought I'd do is just start off for maybe 15-20 minutes, tell you a little bit about the scenarios in the book, Fate of the Nation, and then we can ad lib it from there. So maybe Lindy, could you press a few buttons there? And, so let's just sort of what does the book cover and what does it deal with? The book was published in end of June. It went to print. So it came out. So it went to print at the start of the ANC's national conference. It was appeared in the bookshelves end of July, early August. The scenarios are the result of several years of work that I did at the Institute over many years. The forecasting model that I used is the International Futures Forecasting Model from the Institute for Futures Studies at the University of Denver. I spent a few months there as a Fulbright Fellow a few years ago, and I've written a number of papers on the future of South Africa. There at the back there's a paper on African futures, key trends to 2035, so on and so forth. So I thought I'll start off with just giving you a summary of what's in the book. Lindy, can you? Yeah, I think so. It deals, Lindy, as you've said, with Zuma, his rise to power, the role that the RDP played, and Gear, and how that played a role. Because many of us think that Zuma just turned to BRICS and to China. That was at a time of a global recession, and China was the next growth pole for South Africa. So shifted to China as membership of the BRICS. And also, of course, as an alternative to Thabo Mbeki and his approach. We've paid a price. We've had certain advantages. We've paid a price for that. And the confusion that we've seen in the last few years, incompetence, confusion, incoherence within government policy. So the book really models election trends. And to do that, I break the ANC, which, as we know, is a complex, broad church, into two broad factions, the traditionalists and the reformers, and I'll come to that, and then the importance of the so-called swing vote. And that allows me to model where South Africa is going to go for the three major parties, the ANC, the DA, and the EFF. And there's an election forecast for three scenarios for 2019, 2024, 2029 for these three parties in three different scenarios. And those three scenarios are Bafana, which is our national soccer team. We bumble along. We don't really have a captain. We're not really fit. We sort of play together. We pass the ball. But you know, it's sort of it's not a very inspiring team. We don't have a plan. There's a guy called a captain, but we're not sure what his role really is, and so on and so forth. So nation divided is, Bafana is where the ANC holds together. It can hold together in two ways. If we look at December 2017, you can hold together that Cyril wins and Dlamini Zuma is the deputy, and the Tripartite Alliance holds together, or Zili Mkhize from KwaZulu-Natal is appointed as the compromise candidate, but the party talks left, walks right, well, really falls over itself. It remains divided. This is Bafana. South Africa remains in the 5 minute to 12 terrain where we've been for the last 50 years, but we struggle along, we bumble along. Nation divided. To put it in simple terms, Dlamini Zuma wins, the traditionalists wins, the ANC splits next year, because Gauteng ANC have got nowhere to go. Gauteng, depending how big that split is, the ANC definitely goes under 50% with the 2019 elections, and all kinds of things happen. But the ANC probably goes into an alliance with the EFF. We go down the road of Venezuela and these kind of countries, because we live beyond our means. The ANC becomes increasingly populist, but because Gauteng ANC is split off, the new party can enter into alliance with the DA, so they take Gauteng, and once Gauteng is also under the control of the DA, the ANC is a rural party, and it's a question of time, really. But that time, South Africa takes a lot of pain in the process, because if you live beyond your means, the markets punish you, whether you like the market or not. It's not an ideological position. Mandela magic is where the reformers really have a real win in December. So Cyril and his merry men rush off and do well, and in this scenario the tripartite alliance splits. South Africa, the ANC manages to get 59% in the 2019 elections. The ANC remains in power. And the reformers, the Social Democrats, are able to reform the ANC and bring it into the 21st century. Instead of going the traditionalist route, the big man syndrome where we've seen the ANC go at the moment, a rural party, really a party that looks backward. You see the ANC return to its roots as a largely urban, multi-ethnic constitutionalist party. The ANC remains in power, South Africa grows. South Africa grows under all three of those scenarios because we have considerable growth potential. South Africa's average growth rate since the Second World War is 3.4%. It's our average growth rate. The NDP says we have to grow at 5.4%. We don't get to 5.4% average growth under any of these three scenarios. Our modeling indicates that it would take tremendous effort to get South Africa to get to average growth rates of 3.4%, never mind 5.4%. So in the nation divided, we grow at about 1.3% on average out of 2024. In Bafana, 2.3%. In Mandela Magic, 3.3%. Much more has to be done if South Africa is to get to levels of growth that can deal with inequality and poverty. Significantly more in terms of the restructuring of the economy and so on. Next one. So, I set out the economic and social impact of every scenario. Next one. There's a chapter on trends in crime, violence and instability. I'm from the Institute for Security Studies. We specialize in bad news. The crime stats will be out next week. We actually have the crime stats already, and we will see that crime in South Africa has gone down since 1994 until 2011, 2012, when through the legacy of Jakkie Cilliers and others, crime has increased. And we are almost back to the levels we were in 1994 if you measure crime by 100,000 people in South Africa. A large factor of that is simply the damage that has been done to the police and the criminal justice system through the cadre deployment of incompetent politicians to run police, the criminal justice system generally. So there's a chapter on crime and violence that sets out the scenes, the scenarios, and the impact of the different scenarios. There is a chapter on South Africa in Africa in an international context. The ISS, and there's some of our publications at the back, we work on broad human security issues. So we have offices in Addis and Nairobi and Abidjan and Dakar, and we focus on the challenges in Africa. So there's a chapter that positions South Africa in the comparative African context. Africa is our major export destination. It's the only area where we have a competitive advantage when it comes to particularly manufactured goods. Regional integration, growth in Africa is very important, but we are a laggard in Africa. We grow slower than much of Africa. We, in actual fact, pull down growth in the rest of the continent at the moment. But of course, we are an upper middle income country. So we will nominally grow slower than the rest of much of Africa. But there's a chapter that looks at South Africa in a global and in African and international context. And then there's a concluding chapter, which is really entitled Towards Meaningful Radical Economic Transformation. And the essential challenge for South Africa is that we need to place growth in the formal sector, employment creation in the formal sector at the heart of every decision we make. We have a structural unemployment in South Africa that will not be resolved in the next generation. There are a large component of South Africans that are not suitable, they're not educated, their parents form participation in the modern economy. Their parents haven't had a job, they have never had a job. Structural unemployment, the 28%, will remain a feature of South Africa for decades. So we will have poverty alleviation measures, we will have work creation measures, and we have to both live with that legacy while trying to create a knowledge economy. But if you don't create a knowledge economy, if you don't grow South Africa and grow jobs in the formal sector, nothing else is possible. Only jobs in the formal sector can, over time, reduce inequality, and reduce poverty. Nothing else. We cannot spend our way, we cannot redistribute our way out of this. So placing jobs, growth in the formal economy at the heart of every decision is really critical to our future. And there are a series of recommendations with regard to what should be done, the National Development Plan, and so on. So, the three scenarios, Mandela Magic, where the reformers triumph in the ANC, Bafana, muddling along. I start the book off by quoting R.W. Johnson, who wrote his book, How Long Will South Africa Survive? Except he wrote the first book 38 years ago. So he had to do an update, because obviously South Africa has survived. So, forecasting is a framing of the future. It's not a prediction. So what I've written will be wrong, there's no doubt about it, but it gives us a way to think and frame our discussions of the future. Dominant factions, remember? So, the book, the basic is that politics drives economics. That's the premise, and there are many books and stuff, and we can differ about that. To model the election forecast, and there's a whole chapter on election trends and why I come to the forecasts that we do. As Lindy also said, I divide the ANC into three broad groupings. The first is the traditionalists, press it again, and the reformers. So traditionalists, the rural black conservative, nationalists, social conservative, dominated by Zulu speakers. They believe in a centralized state, in redistributive policies. They're not really constitutionalists. And this would include some components of the Premier League, the Youth League, the Women's League. Of course, this is a simplification, of course. And the reformers, social democrats, typically urban, supported by born-free voters. Now, we've done a forecast of the size of the born-free vote, and we've done a forecast of South Africa's population size using the International Futures Forecasting System. Our forecast is that South Africa will have significantly more people by 2030 than the National Development Plan forecast, about 2 million more people. And the reason is simply inward migration is higher than what the National Development Plan assumed. And that means that the Western Cape and Gauteng in particular will have many more people, but not only those two provinces. We had to update the population forecasts for the other modeling that we do. The reformers are more multi-ethnic. They believe in a mixed economy and inclusive economic growth, of course, Gauteng, ANC, and others. And then the third component, are the shift voters. These are the increased numbers of voters that are supportive of the ANC, but are just not prepared to vote for the ANC under Jacob Zuma. I mean, he is a disgrace, to be frank, to every South African and what he is engaged in. And so many ANC voters stay away. The alliance is falling apart. He has managed to bring factionalism and new patrimonialism, Lindy told me, into South Africa. What happens with the shift vote is very important, because will Dlamini Zuma or Cyril be able to attract them, and where will they go? In the base case forecast, I think the Bafana forecast, I think the ANC will get about 53% in 2019. That's more than most people think. And the reason is that any management will be better than Jacob Zuma. So the ANC are going to get a bump next year under new management. It may split, but certainly even Dlamini Zuma is a competent manager, will be able to attract more support to the ANC. But let's go there. Okay, so those, depending on what happens with the shift vote, is really going to determine, what happens with the scenario outcomes. So to summarize the scenarios quickly, nation divided, the traditionalists triumph, the ANC splits next year. Zuma can remain president in this scenario until 2019, but that would be a disaster for the ANC. They get about 40 to 44% in 2019, so they have to enter into an alliance with smaller parties or the EFF. The ANC under this scenario could lose power in 2024, which could lead to a DA-led coalition in 2029. This is a scenario of fiscal populism. South Africa grows at about 1.5% to 2034, more aggressive black empowerment policies, including land distribution, but as we know, the main problem with land distribution is the state. It's not the availability of land. The economy is about 30% larger by 2034 than it is today. That is nothing, you know. South Africa builds 6 nuclear stations, particularly after the appointment of the latest Minister of Energy, under contract from Rosatom. South Africa's position in Africa continues relative decline. We opt for co-leadership in Africa. We can't really offer peacekeeping. Lindy seems to be writing a book on the future of the military, and support, and we're a polarized society. Bafana, next slide, is where the ANC prioritizes unity above all else. Zuma is recalled early next year, which I think is almost a done deal. The ANC gets about 53% in 2019, but they lose Gauteng, probably to a DA-led coalition. It can lead to a DA-led coalition in 2024, but it's more likely that by 2024 we have an ANC-EFF type of government. But probably, if the current party formulation holds, we look at a DA national government in 2029. ANC walks left, talks right. South Africa grows about 2.3%. General management, the economy is about 50% bigger than it is today. Not good. We only built 2 nuclear stations. Well, basically we can't afford to build more. There's limited fracking for gas. Continued decline, but we're still a member of the BRICS and the G20, a divided society. And the next one, Mandela magic, with reformers triumph. Zuma is also recalled early next year. The tripartite alliance breaks up. Modernization of the ANC, which gets 59% in 2019, and they managed to hold on with a coalition of smaller parties to Gauteng. And the ANC governs throughout the election forecast. This is a sort of a social democracy kind of scenario that enters into partnership with the private sector. So the only way for South Africa to grow is a partnership with the private sector. We've run out of options. We can lend from the World Bank and the IMF or the Chinese, but we can't have a society where private sector, which is the largest component of our society, is at war with government. You cannot grow a society. Private sector is 80% of the economy. South Africa grows 3.3% in 2034, focus on private land ownership in the former homelands, very important. That's how you unlock support in the homelands for the new reformist ANC leadership. The economy by 2034 is 80% bigger, not great shakes, better, but none of these scenarios are sufficient to grow our way out of our current levels of poverty and unemployment. We go for renewables, we frack the hell out of the Karoo, I said that very carefully. We import gas from Mozambique, and we maintain a leadership position in Africa, and there's a forecast of power and influence in the book as well. Next slide. Sorry, just go on. No, another one. Sorry, just carry on. You'll at some point. Okay. This is the forecast for Bafana. Press again, and once again, and once again, and once again. Okay, this is the election. Once more. This is the election. Okay, I'll keep it like that for a moment. So, on the percent support under the Bafana base case forecast, the most likely 2014 percentage of support, the ANC at the moment's got 62%. So under this forecast, they get 53% in 2019, 44% in 2024, 37%. The DA grows from 22, its current 22% to about 48%. The EFF remains, it peaks at about 12%, on the understanding that many who vote for the EFF, it's a protest vote in reality against the ANC. Really, when it comes to is the EFF an alternative governing party, it becomes a different ball game. Press again. This is what the 2019 election support translates into Parliament. This is a base case forecast. The DA gets about 112. They were not happy. I presented this to the DA caucus in Joburg 3 days ago. They were not happy. ANC 212, EFF about 48. So this is the forecast for each of these three scenarios in the book. Next one. This is growth. 1994, Mandela's period, Mbeki, Zuma. Now it's important to recognize, and then a forecast out to 2034, this is percent change in average levels of income. The top line, I'm colorblind, but the top line, whichever color that is, yellow, orange, orange. That is the average for upper middle income countries globally. South Africa has, for the last 30, 40 years, grown 2% below the average for upper middle income countries. That is the result of apartheid. That is the cost of not investing in growth, in education, and all of these kind of things. So under the three scenarios, top scenario is nation divided, is Mandela Magic. Bafana, nation divided. We get back to the average of other countries. That's all. And now the levers that we pull in to make Mandela Magic happen. We invest more in R&D. We invest more in, the government becomes more effective. And a variety of other levers that we pull in the modeling software to make that happen. It just underpins the fact that if South Africa is ready to grow itself out, to repeat the point, much more needs to be done to move from a very capital intensive economic model to a decentralized, much more flexible economy that can grow. Okay, so that's the forecast. I think the next slide. And the final chapter deals with meaningful radical economic transformation. Makes Lowe's point, only jobs in the formal economy can significantly reduce inequality and poverty. Nothing else can. Ownership can't change that. We need to update and implement the National Development Plan. It is quite outdated. So the forecast in Fate of the Nation updates the population and other forecasts, and then does so on. We need a strong developmental state. While I speak of a partnership with the private sector as an absolute prerequisite, it doesn't mean you can leave it to the private sector. If you leave it to the private sector, you will have more inequality and more poverty. So you need a strong developmental state that regulates and channels South Africa's growth towards inclusion and all those things that we, more nimble economy, more flexible economy, less concentrated economy, but we are where we are. We are the result of a minerals energy complex, and we have to grow our way out of that. You can't just wish you're going to have some kind of other economy. We are the result of partnership with the private sector for employment and economy, but we have significant growth potential because the ANC, since coming into power, has invested in the provision of water, sanitation, electricity, education. Yes, there's been lots of corruption and all kinds of stuff. Bottom line is that even in 2017, it's always important to recognize that South Africa is in an immeasurably better place than it was in 1994. It's just no comparison. Yet, the last decade has been a wasted decade in a large extent. So we look forward with some degree of hope about where South Africa could be headed. So Lindy, that's the summary of the book, and I'm in your hands.
Okay, good. I'm just going to ask Jakkie one question and then we'll put it over the floor. One of the things that struck me out of this book and sort of made me kind of like nervous is like what's going to happen in December, the ANC election, and you keep on sort of saying it's a Talimi Zuma or Ramaphosa option, but we're hearing a lot of talk about Lindy Sisulu. So is that a fait accompli that we're going to have these two people, only the two people emerging? Isn't there maybe another third actor? And I seem to get the impression that Talimi Zuma is going to take us down the divided path, and that you're hoping that Ramaphosa will take us out of Bafana into Mandela Magic.
The forecasts in the book thus far hold up, and I wrote in end of last year, beginning of this year, that Lindiwe is probably Cyril's deputy, and I still believe that to be what will happen. She is she's not a. My view is that the ANC is that it's still between the two contenders, between Dlamini Zuma and Ramaphosa, and that Ramaphosa's ticket is, and he said that, for a woman deputy leader, and that will be Lindy Sisulu. I don't buy the argument that the conference will not occur. I think the damage to the ANC, if that doesn't happen in December, will be too big. They just can't avoid. Zuma's going to try, and I think scuttles so it doesn't happen, but I think it will happen. I think William and Tasha and everybody else will make sure that it does happen. Nobody knows what's going to happen, because none of us, well, maybe some of you guys, can do sufficient work at branch level to be able to do a forecast. So we need to be careful of being captured of what the media is saying and the extent to which the media are portraying one particular story, whereas in the rural areas and at branch level, very different things may be unfolding. So that's why scenarios provide us with a way of thinking about the future and setting different options on the table. But I think the conference is going to happen. I tend towards the view that the wind is behind Ramaphosa's sail at the moment, but that he's not going to have a sufficient large majority, and that probably what's going to happen is that he will be, Dlamini Zuma will probably become a deputy president of the ANC, one of the two, because there's going to be probably a constitutional change within the ANC to allow for 2 deputy presidents, but that within the country, I tend towards the view that Lindy was going to be deputy president of South Africa. But I'm probably wrong.
Okay, then just one last question. Before we met today, I had a lot of discussions with Jakkie in terms of the whole issue of the relationship between economic growth and population growth, and he had some really interesting modeling. What do you think this will have on the future trajectory in terms of these 3 scenarios?
South Africa is demographically in a sweet spot, apart from the damage that HIV/AIDS has done to the country. The median age in South Africa is about 26, which means that we are escaping the potential youth bulge, which is from 19 to 26. Countries that have a high youth bulge are more unstable than have and we are in a sweet spot. We should be growing much more rapidly than we are. The reason we are not growing is largely to do with incoherence of government policy and lack of implementation. There's a chapter in the book called the Republic of No Consequences, because that's exactly where we are. There is no consequence, except particularly if you're within the Zuma camp, there's no consequences for what you do. And the wastage and the corruption in South Africa, the billions of dollars that are being spent, wasted. The economy is running the country is no different to running your own bank business. If you spend more than you can afford, or you waste money on South African Airways, somebody made the point the other day, we could have bought Emirates airline for the amount of money that has been spent on South Africa. At some point we have to cut our cloth. We are now in a position where our levels of debt are approaching the levels of debt that they were in 1994. At that point, only the RDP saved South Africa from a structural adjustment program. We are very close to that. We can lend money from the BRICS Bank, yes. We are going to need severe fiscal discipline, which is a bad word, in South Africa, if we are going to live within our means. So demographically, we have great potential. We should be growing more rapidly, and I think we were also talking about the relationship between working age and. I've just finished a paper where I did a forecast on development aid to Africa. I did a forecast out, looking where that's going to take us, because that's my job. I do forecasting, and I was telling Lindy that the main problem for why Africa cannot grow because we cannot get to our demographic dividend. The size of our working population, 15 to 64, of Africa, the rest of Africa, is never enough. We have too many dependents, in this case, children. So if you look at a population pyramid of Mozambique, we've just done a big study on Mozambique, it looks like this. The median age in Mozambique is, I think, 17. If you can't increase the size of the working age versus your dependents, you can't change your dependency ratio. And that structurally, from a structural point of view, is the biggest inhibitor on Africa's growth. The rest of the world has gone through the demographic transition much more rapidly, but we are not. We are largely still rural Africa. We are not, and because female education is low, we're not getting to the demographic dividend. Now, certain countries in Africa, Ethiopia in particular, has been able to, despite relatively low levels of upper secondary female education, to reduce fertility rates. And that means that Ethiopia, in actual fact, you're going to see GDP per capita, or income per capita, increase quite rapidly. But that relationship of the size of your working age population and your dependence, in the case of Africa, there's a direct correlation between that size and growth. If you're German, you would say to me, no, but you need to be educated before you can grow. You need to educate people that can then get a job. It's actually not, it's important, but it's not as important as simply the size of your working age population. And you can forecast growth rates simply by looking at that relative size, more so than most people think.
The floor is now yours. Sandra?
Oh, thank you. That was great and oddly comforting. Because it really reminded me how Jan Smuts said, in South Africa the worst never happens. These are three very calming scenarios. And by the way, I do see why Cyril endorsed the book.
Yes. I should say something about that.
Okay, so just two small questions. And the first one is about, I know you mentioned fracking, but where's the environment in this, in your scenario? Where's climate change in the agricultural sector? And then the second question, I obviously don't expect that to be in the book, but perhaps you've got interesting things to say about the higher education sector and where the universities are going. Because we know a thing or two about fiscal discipline as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I answer that? No.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much. Let me be honest about the quote. When the book was finished, the way this works, I sent copies of the book to Cyril and to the leader of the DA. What's it? What's his name? Musi. So I have these moments of blank spot. And to be honest, Cyril didn't read the book. It was sent to him, and within a few days, people came back, and I got a nice quote for the front cover. Musi's people were concerned that I didn't spell his name correctly. No, it was just happened, but I was very glad to be able to get a quote. But it's not an endorsement, and the book was finished by the time I sent it to him to get a quote. But I was very glad to get a quote. The environment in the international futures forecasting system that we use has got an environmental subcomponent or sub-module within it. It's got 12 modules, which there's an environmental module. But the effect of the environmental module really is largely on agricultural growth, agricultural productivity. So it reduces, South Africa is going to become drier over time, and it reduces agricultural productivity in South Africa, in this instance, over time by, let's say, over this time horizon by about 3 or 4%, I think, on average. But we have done we have done a significant amount of work on for the Water Research Commission. We've actually, in fact, for the first time, done a national water forecast on supply and demand for South Africa. It's on our website. It's called Parched Prospects. There's been Parched Prospects 1, which we published. Then the National Water Commission came to us and said, "Wow, nobody's ever tried to do a national water supply and demand forecast, because you don't really have an integrated national water supply or demand system." So, talk. They then commissioned us to do an update, Parched Prospects 2, and we've just delivered to them a third update. And there's some of it is in the book. Short story, as you in the Western Cape will know, water is the most important constraint on South Africa's growth going forward. Our supply and demand, and we modeled every dam and major infrastructure project in South Africa for our supply forecast, and then we looked at, we had a demand forecast. And South Africa is living beyond its means and will continue to do so despite every project that government is planning. So if you assume that government implements on time and in budget every infrastructure project on water, we still live below our means. Water is like electricity. It's not a crisis until it's a crisis. And then you have to spend billions of rand, if not dollars, to deal with water. So you guys know this. We are wasting 36% of municipal water, 44% of agricultural water, and so on and so forth. We face an uphill battle. The National Development Plan says that South Africa should expand its agricultural sector, and that could be a source of growth and employment. And it sets a target of 500,000 hectares of land to be placed under irrigation. It can't happen. Our forecasts are that the most land you can place under irrigation is 144,000 hectares by 2030. So, yes, we can go up agro manufacturing and these kind of things, but agricultural sector is not a panacea for South Africa's development. Agriculture is 3% of our economy. It employs 18%, I can't remember, of South Africans, so it's important. And we are self-sufficient when it comes to food, whereas the rest of Africa is largely a food exporter, despite our massive agricultural potential. So big challenges. Agriculture is not a panacea for South Africa, and the book is really all about growing your manufacturing sector, because if you don't grow your manufacturing sector, your tertiary and your primary sectors don't hold together. And how do we grow our manufacturing sector? And then you asked the question of education. There is a lot of education in the book. We've done a forecast of an actual fact of education for primary, lower secondary, upper secondary. We use the American system as well as tertiary. And lots of problems that I don't need to repeat here. We know that free tertiary education can't happen. It's just not financially possible. But the other arguments, again, stuff that you would know. We need to establish a vocational training as a separate stream, like at the start of secondary schooling, so that South Africans, that we prepare people for the fourth industrial revolution and all that kind of stuff. So that's the direction that South Africa should be going. And then, you know, stuff like we need to go for a single language of instruction across South Africa. We can't afford, and we won't be able to. But there's a lot on education and the challenges that we face. And I think for me the interesting thing is what we need. We don't need the highest level of education. We need appropriate levels of education for the jobs that people are going to do. And that's the South Korean and the other experience that I think, of course, at the moment nothing's going to happen until 2019, because we're just going to fight and so on.
Good. All right, Joseph. Nikki, on that side? Yes. And then there is a question here and here. Yes.
Thanks very much for your presentation. I just want to ask, in light of the recent cabinet reshuffle and our new Minister of Energy, there's some talk that it's trying to move ahead with the whole nuclear deal in light of the December election conference. So could you reflect a little bit in terms of our relationship with the Russians and what is happening with the nuclear deal, and is it going to be pushed through, and what is the future trajectory with our relationship with Russia?
So the book includes the scenarios include different energy forecasts. So in Nation Divided, we said South Africa goes nuclear. It builds all 6 nuclear plants, despite the fact that we have a smaller economy. We need less electricity, and we have a surplus of electricity at the moment already, because a corrupt deal seems to have been made. There is no logical reason for South Africa to go nuclear. There is none, zero, zilch. But if you have Eskom as the provider that is both the provider of electricity and the distributor of electricity, and so on and so forth, what do you expect? So, Nation Divided, we go for 6, although we can't afford it. And the economy becomes more capital intensive, the exact reverse of where you want to go. Under Bafana, we sort of go for 2 before we can get rid of Zuma, kind of stuff. And in Bafana, in Mandela Magic, we go for renewables and fracking. And you go for a distributed system. You import gas from Mozambique. Mozambique's got the 4th largest liquid gas reserves in the world. We need the infrastructure, and we frack. Because gas is the transition energy away from coal. And it's also the logical, if we can get around the water constraints, it's in my view, and I'll probably get shot for this, but is the logical way for South Africa to go. We can't carry on with our current dependence on coal, but coal is going to remain a huge component. I think that the nuclear deal is a payback for some reason. There are rumors of monies that have exchanged hands, and is like a down payment for our membership of BRICS. And it's the same. South Africa pays a huge price to China. BRICS was a tremendous achievement for South Africa membership. We play with the big guys, but we are 2% of the BRICS economy. 2%. By 2030, we'll be 1% of BRICS. There's a paper at the back that I did on that. We're a small BRIC. And South Africa should be aspiring towards a rules-based global order, not an order that in actual fact, our opening up to China has helped to deindustrialize South Africa. Our major competitive advantage, particularly for manufactured goods, is in the rest of Africa. That's our natural market. That's where we can sell stuff. But China produces the size of the South African economy every 8 months. It's just. But we need to protect and look after the Buy South Africa campaign and all these kind of things. So one can't help but think that South Africa, we are the most enthusiastic BRIC member that you will find. And I think that has served us well, just levered us into a different position. But it doesn't provide a vehicle for South Africa's growth, I think. We need to have an even-handed approach in that. So I think that the cabinet reshuffle very clearly is an effort to fast-track the nuclear deal. There's no other explanation for it.
You've got a question next, yes, and then
Me?
you next. Yes?
Oh, okay. The difficulty about coming to such a session. Sorry, I'm doing from Department of Social Anthropology and Sociology. But the difficulty about coming to such a session is that I have not read the book. But what I will ask is the things that you haven't mentioned. I'm curious what the Bafana name. Why not the Springbok name? That's the first question. The second question is around the roles of unions in mobilizing and branching, because we do know that in 2008, the reason why Zuma is in place is because COSATU, particularly and SSCP, played a huge role in getting their members to be both SACP members, COSATU members, and also ANC members. So what stands out for me, having not read the book, is that the role that the unions play, especially at branch level, where you find that some ANC members are either COSATU affiliated trade unions or SSCP members. So for me, what stands out is the role that unions play in shaping alliance politics. And your take on that?
Yeah, no, thanks. This is when I wrote the first scenario. The Springboks are still doing fairly well. That's honestly the reason. I've used the names for about 3 or 4 years. The first paper came out in 2014, so I just stuck with the names. But I can have used today. I could have used the Springboks. That's actually the reason. Unions, the ANC that came to South Africa in 1990 is a much smaller organization, the Exile ANC, than most people recognize. They rode on the back of the UDF and so on and so forth. When they were preparing for the 1994 elections, as you probably know, they entered in. Labour was different. Labour was here. Labour had organized. Labour had fought the apartheid state. So the ANC entered into an alliance with COSATU ahead of the 1994 elections, because only COSATU could provide the ANC with a national organizational structure across the whole country. And labor was different then. COSATU was a big beast. So in exchange for that partnership, the COSATU negotiated with the ANC that the RDP be the basis of ANC economic policy. This is all set out in the book in the first few chapters, how that happened and so on and so forth. So Labour was set South Africa's economic policies and continued to do that until 4 or 5 years ago. But COSATU today is it represents government employees. It's no longer the trade union that it used to be. And a variety of reasons. The mining sector is in decline, manufacturing is in decline, and labor is split. So if we want to grow employment in the country, we need to move towards a more flexible labor system. You can't grow employment if you believe that to be important with the kind of rigidities that you have. And that means in the Mandela Magic scenario, the scenario is basically that the tripartite alliance splits, as it's basically happened already in a sense. SACP is it's an intellectual force within the ANC, but it's really no longer where Zuma has taken the ANC and where the SACP are very, very far from the days of 1994, when the tripartite alliance was so powerful in South Africa. So the stranglehold, the control, the agenda-setting role that COSATU played until recently is no longer there. The ANC is, in a sense, on its own. Is the ANC going to be able to set its own economic policies and frameworks? Because some of those policies and frameworks are going to run, as I'm implying, into opposition with organised labour. But I think that labour is no longer the force that it was, and I also, on the one side, I'm arguing for a sort of pro-business, more flexible labour market system, because I don't think we have much of a choice in the matter. But there's going to be a contestation about that in South Africa. There's no doubt, because the South African Social Compact was built upon labour rights that were, from the days of Curry's Fountain in 1974 onwards, were fought for and achieved through a very difficult process. So how that's going to fold out, I don't know, but that's going to be a difficult struggle.
Good, we've got a question in front here.
Thank you. I've enjoyed I'm partway through the book and I'm enjoying it. I'd like to think with you a little bit about what it means to speak about factionalism within the ANC. Mostly people who speak about this have a very much an agency point of view. And you did too. Then you dressed it up a little bit, talking about traditionalists and reformers. So that suggests some social features in it, but it doesn't. I think they end up being Zuma as a traditionalist, and the rest is reformers. And the other thing is, you don't speak at all, haven't spoken today at all, about clientelism. And one of the most important ways of approaching what's going on in the ANC is to suggest it's becoming a clientelistic organization, and then the question of breaking it would suggest a kind of different factional approach. Let me add one more factor to give you something else to chew on here. You speak about, I think usefully, the Gauteng grouping, and you spoke about it as if it would break away. I don't mean break away necessarily from the party, but lead in a different direction, lead toward the reformers. So there's an industrial base in Gauteng which helps to support an argument, and that brings you into a much more structuralist position. So thinking about all those things, it'd be interesting to see how you think about all those things.
Well, my dad was a structural sociologist, so what did I say? Functionalist.
Yeah, there's always a rebellion between father and son.
That's true. I do a simplistic categorization of the ANC to be able to allow me to model the forecasts. So that's where the three groupings come from, and it is it's a caricature of the true complexity that is the ANC, because it allows me to play around with voter turnouts and to see where that takes us. Actually, in fact, I find that voter turnout had in the modelling I did, had quite a limited impact in actual fact on the scenarios. But the idea with what I do not do is I do not look at the book maybe enough about the complete implosion of the ANC or some kind of what we refer to as a black swan event that can really have a different impact on the ANC. And the book is not informed by workshops and groupings where I canvassed data or understandings of ANC thinking and voting. It's not. It's me and my computer. And but I did quite a few interviews with members in the ANC and the DA, and not that much within the EFF when I did the original version of the scenarios, which 2 previous papers appeared on that, 2015 and 2016. That I built on in the development of the scenario names and the forecasts. So, quite simplistically, the argument is that Gauteng ANC, which is, let's say, the most progressive region within the ANC, has nowhere to go if the traditionalist grouping in the ANC is victorious, because they know that that means that Gauteng will go to a DA-led coalition. And that's really, so to retain power, they break away, and then potentially in alliance with the DA, they can then run Gauteng, because the DA would not easily get a majority in Gauteng in 2019. They may get it in 2024, but like the Western Cape, much more likely is that the ANC will go below 50%, and the DA may be able to put together a governing coalition in Gauteng in 2019. And then, hopefully in their scenario, be able to demonstrate improved governance and service delivery, and then get an absolute majority in 2024. But once the DA has gotten Gauteng, the next hurdle is much more difficult. Because it has a natural ceiling. It is an urban-based, middle-class kind of party that has to, it has made a transition from, in leadership, it is making a policy transition, but those things are not yet complete. So it faces an uphill battle, whereas the ANC has the liberation ethos. The EFF is seen as sort of a wayward son or daughter. It's not really seen as an, and that the EFF's way to power is really a coalition with the ANC. As an independent party in my modeling, I don't see the EFF really becoming more than a power broker, but a power broker is a very important role. And they play, in 2 of the scenarios, they play a potentially important role. But I don't see an alliance with the DA and the EFF, for example, at national level. I think the ideologies are just too far apart. So that's how I've done it, and the thinking that goes behind the various scenarios. I'm not responding to the sort of the deeper issues you're raising, but that's sort of how I've done it.
Good. Is Kiers in front hand? Anybody else? If I can just pick up in the hands? No? Okay, Kiers?
Yeah, my name is Kiers van der Waal. I remember in the early 90s, there was also a time when we were seeing a lot of scenario building. I think it was Bobby Gottsel was actually turning out different scenarios, Higher Road and the Jackal strategy and so on. Is this part of a historical turning point that one has more emphasis on scenario building? You may know because you work in this field. And are there other scenarios appearing at the moment or recently? And how do you position yourself within them? And what is then underlying your book in terms of the political message, because I think the book is partly to try and influence the thinking. So one aspect of that is, how has your book been received so far, if you have sufficient feedback already?
Thanks very much. Bobby Gotzel's got a master's degree in sociology from Stellenbosch University, I should add, if you didn't know. And he was with him together with Francois Slabbat, they were in the same class, together with one guy who became Simon Becker. So no, it wasn't Simon Becker, he went to Canada. Simon Becker. Yeah. Anyways. The book starts off, Fate of the Nation, with talking about the importance of scenarios. And the person you're thinking about from Anglo-American is not Bobby Gotzel, it's, what's the guy's name? Clem Sunter.
Oh yes, sorry. Yeah.
Clem Sunter. And the book starts off by tracing the history of scenarios, because in the 1990s to 1994, NEDCOR did a series of scenarios. And those NEDCOR scenarios, I presented them to Joe Modise in the top echelon of Umkhonto we Sizwe in Midrand in 1992 or 1993. Were very influential in shaping the future of South Africa. And then after that, there were a number of others. There was the Dinokeng scenarios and a variety of others. And they're all in the first chapter of the book, in actual fact. And that actually makes the argument, I do believe that scenarios are hugely important. South Africans, we fight with one another about where we come from and where we are. But as soon as we start looking at where we want to go, many of those differences disappear, because there's very little difference about what we want to do with our country. We all love the country. We all want to see it grow and all these kind of things. And scenarios are, and thinking about where we want to take South Africa is hugely powerful in lifting our eyes beyond the immediate horizon and looking a bit further out. And then getting to agreement on where we want to take the country. I remember presenting those scenarios to Joe. Now, Joe Modise is a strange guy. And Joe was absolutely transfixed with the scenarios. And that really played a huge role in building, that's where South Africa's social compact comes from. It comes from those scenarios, the Dinokeng scenarios in a series, the whole idea of the Rainbow Nations, and comes from these scenario building exercises. And we are at a difficult point, and I think that going back to those scenarios will help South Africa. We need to recapture a vision for the future, and I think the scenarios can play a huge role in that. So I'm selling my book.
How has it been received?
Well, literally all the political people have read the book, because obviously it's about scenarios, and they look at their, like Musi Maimang was not very happy about, because the DA does the best of all the three parties when you look long term. It does well under all three scenarios, and it's done the best under the last, it's a 30% increase literally. They'd like to see more. It's not, they are making the argument that the DA can win in 2019. No, I don't think that's possible. Unless the ANC, really splits down the middle, and that's all. So it's been well received, but with some caution, because it's within the ANC. It makes the argument that the only hope for the ANC is a reinvigoration, a modernization of the ANC. In actual fact, the book is a greater wake-up call for the ANC than it is for anybody else, because it says where you are headed at the moment is you're becoming a ruralist, a traditionalist party, where, if that's where you want to go, you lose urban influence and agenda, and you become irrelevant. You lose control over the heart of the economy, which they do. If they lose Gauteng, in my view, the ANC's goose is cooked. So, can a Cyril or whomever else reinvigorate the ANC? That's a huge challenge. You can only do that, in my view, if you move away from the kind of big man politics, big man in the traditionalist sense, big chief politics of Jacob Zuma, which means a modernist ANC, where the ANC returns to its modern, to its real multi-racial and modernist views. But that's not where Jacob Zuma is taking the ANC. So in a sense, in that sense, it's, in my view, it is really a wake-up call for the ANC about where it needs to take the party. And I think the party, okay, so I can, so that's the message really, in a sense, the most important message for the dominant party in South Africa. And I'm making the argument as well that the ANC remains until probably 2023, ahead of the 2024 elections. That's where the action is. What happens in the ANC will determine South Africa's future. So the DA don't like that, because they say, no, but we're going to ask these guys in 2019, and I'm saying, well, it may be possible, but I only think that's possible if the ANC splits. Or if Jacob Zuma stays on until 2019 as President of South Africa, which he can do, but which I don't think, the ANC would be incredibly stupid to allow that to happen. Because he's the best election candidate, he's the best election machine for the DA in the EFF you can imagine.
Thomas, and then Cheryl after that.
Yeah, thanks very much, and really fascinating discussion. And there's a bunch of anthropologists and sociologists in the room who might have thought that they need to listen to people on the ground, and you pointed to that complexity, that some of these categories that you're using fall down, and so that's a sort of cheap shot, I guess. But the question I want to ask has to do with what might have flowed out of that, this your claim around the formal economy. When Lindy came out with his ladders between the two economies concept, a lot of scholars freaked out at this.
Yeah.
This doesn't tell us anything about what's really going on the ground. It's as ideological as your own tea leaf reading, in a sense. I'm being a bit unkind, but in a sense, might there be a way in which the complexity of life upends some of these abstractions? And another question I have is around the global economy and the anxiety around robots and
Fourth Industrial Revolution.
exactly, and so your claims around how South Africa might fit into that, and you gestured towards that, but I want to unpack that a little more. Thanks.
Thanks. I like
You want
that.
to take Cheryl's question
Yes.
start? Yes,
If you
Cheryl.
don't mind, because I think it sort of builds a little bit or relates to what the points that have just been made. And first of all, thank you for your presentation, because it does, it's useful for thinking with, and obviously we are very concerned about the fate of the nation and the state of the nation. But I'm trying to understand what your scenarios are, because on the one hand you are presenting them as tools for thinking, but you also seem to be presenting them as these are the only possible options. You've referred to a vision for the future, but it's not clear whether you have an alternative vision or whether you think Mandela Magic is the vision because it's the best we can do. So it's sort of trying to understand that. And then linked to that, it's related to, it's very much focused on the ANC, and obviously that's really significant and important. You look at the DA as a given. So just at the political level, that it's a stable entity with a stable agenda, but you suggest that maybe it's a little bit less than that, but it's going to play a certain role in relation to the dominant party. And then there are these larger global forces, so it's very much focused on, there's reference to BRICS, but what's happening globally, not only internationally, but sort of globally in terms of environmental issues, ecology, and the nature of the changes in global capitalism as well. So it's how you bring those, how you're thinking about those larger issues, and are they not significant for thinking about the future and scenario building as well?
Thanks.
Told you the sociologists give me difficult questions.
I know. No, these are, it is in a sense a normative book in ways that I keep the current party political structure intact, and that may not be. I speak about the three parties as if they are going to determine our future, and that may not be the case. Events, what we refer to as sort of black swan events, unforeseen events, and what happens in the global economy is going to have a huge impact on South Africa. So, but I do assume that the global environment remains relatively stable. We look at about 3-4% average growth rate going up, which is 2.5-3% global economy growth rate going up, which ultimately is unsustainable. If you just look at wealth creation and consumption patterns and stuff, I mean, you know, I do global forecasting, and we cannot proceed on this unsustainable path. But that's maybe a different argument and a different issue to what I can address on a book on South Africa, on the future of South Africa. So I use a current path or a base case forecast on what's going to happen globally, and that is that the current patterns of a new liberal economic framework holds. Even China, is increasingly within a globalized world, and we can speak a lot about what happens globally, but that it's a relatively linear extrapolation of current growth paths. Africa grows at about 4% average for the next 20 years, and so on and so forth. So yes, there is a global scenario behind this, and there is certain assumptions about patterns of growth that account for certain components of the fourth industrial revolution, but we are all divided about what the real impact will be, because every of the 3 previous industrial revolutions have destroyed millions of jobs but created millions of jobs, and we don't really know where this is going to happen. Is a distributed, a decentralized system going to create as much opportunity as it destroys, and where does Africa go? Actual fact, the next paper I'm doing end of this year is about the impact of the fourth industrial revolution and technology on Africa, to see where that takes us. And that's a big challenge, because are we going to be able to pick up low-end manufacturing jobs, and so on and so forth. And I don't have an answer to those issues, to be quite honest. I wish I had, but I'm assuaged by the fact that I think the doomsday forecasts of robots are going to run everything and there are going to be no jobs. I think that will not happen. But certainly Africa's general room for job creation is more limited. As well, you know, when we look towards the medium long term, there's going to be another commodities boom, which is going to be driven by India, and that's going to have a big impact on Africa and on South Africa. But our mining industry is a twilight industry. We're adding by destroying it further through what government is doing at the moment, instead of trying to squeeze the last bit of growth out of it. So commodities, we're not at the end of the commodities. We don't know what the restructuring, the rebalancing of China is going to do. But I think that generally trade patterns are going to slow down because of the rebalancing of the Chinese economy and what that means. To what extent Africa can move, and South Africa in particular, can move into low-end manufacturing, we don't know. The concluding chapter draws on the work that Professor Anthony Butler did at the University of Cape Town, who speaks of South Africa walking on 2 legs, the innovation economy or the knowledge economy and the inclusive economy. Because of our legacy, we need to go up the innovation curve and the knowledge economy curve, else you become irrelevant. At the same time, we have legacy issues, and we have to really we'll have to look at bringing millions of South Africans along with us that will not be part of a modern economy. And I quote, I quote from a guy who's written a lot about sort of economic transformation. Some of you may know Eric Reinhardt, who's sort of an economist who wrote about why rich countries are rich and poor countries remain poor. And he says, the global economy can in many ways be seen as a pyramid scheme of sorts, a hierarchy of knowledge, with those that continuously invest in innovation remain at the apex of welfare. That is so true. The world is not a fair place, and we are not happy about the new liberal world order and the fact to which South Africa is integrated into that, and we are an open economy, if we don't get foreign direct investment much more, we will not grow because we're not saving. These basics remain at the heart of South Africa. So those frameworks do set the broad parameters upon which the forecasts are done. And yes, I am, of course, there are three scenarios, and I'm sort of trying to come up with policy recommendations for Mandela Magic. So what can we do? I make the argument that jobs in the formal sector, there's nothing more important in South Africa. And that whatever can be done to grow jobs in the formal sector should be done. And that should be the focus of the president, whomever he or she is, and of the cabinet. And nothing is more important because, so yes, there are prescriptions and policy recommendations, and there's nothing that is dramatically innovative because in reality there is no magic solution to where we are. There are only decades of long, hard slog to get South Africa from where it is. Under the best case forecast, Mandela Magic, and the forecasts are not shown in the book, we hardly show, even with pro-growth, growing and employment, you hardly shift structural unemployment in South Africa. You don't shift it. So the question really is, what else do we need to do? Because clearly, conventional approaches are not going to do it. So we need need to grow small business and all these we all know this. How do we do this? How do we unlock growth in the South African economy that can take us to 5, 6, 7%? Because only growth rates of above 5% can do something about unemployment, inequality, and poverty in poverty and unemployment in South Africa on the long term. There's no other solution. And so I'm left. I wish I had an answer, but it underlines, in my view, that more needs to be done. I'm not an economist. And I am not a sociologist and an anthropologist or any of these things, but I work at a policy institute. So we, at the end of the day, try and come up with, so what can we do? What are the policy recommendations? And certainly South Africa can go a long way simply by having coherent policies, a cabinet that pulls in the same direction, and where there is where we try and grow employment and reduce and increase the ability of the economy to increase employment. And a lot, I think, can be done in that.
Yes, can I just hold on and see if there's anybody else? Sorry, you had one question, last question then from Jakkie.
Yes, thank you so much for the very inspiring presentation. I'm just talking to my colleague here, and in the light of what you said now, I'm asking my colleague, why are you not talking about investment in the informal economy as a way of promoting economic growth? But I wanted to ask you a question around the Mandela Magic, which to me seems like a very positive scenario. But before I ask you this question, I want to say something that I heard yesterday Chris Mashela say when he was reflecting on the cabinet reshuffle. Prince said yesterday that the tripartite alliance may remain intact until the conference in December, because they are counting on Cyril Ramaphosa winning the elections in December. But if Cyril Ramaphosa lose the contest, then we will see this split. The tripartite alliance, COSATU and the SLCP, will then leave the ANC and contest the elections in 2019. Now, you are saying under the Mandela Magic that we are going to see the breakup of the tripartite alliance. And I think I want to reconcile the two statements, but I want you to reflect on what will lead to this breakup in this positive scenario when Ramaphosa will depend on the power base, the tripartite as a power base. What will then lead to this breakup of the tripartite alliance?
5 minutes.
Okay, thanks. That's an actual fact. You pointed to a very important contradiction. Because the fact that COSATU came out and endorsed Cyril Ramaphosa means that they have constrained his ability to move towards a more flexible labor market. They were very smart in doing so, because he's the only leader that probably realizes the importance of that. But COSATU has changed, and so on and so forth. So that dilemma that you point to, you're absolutely correct. Because the forecast on the one hand says that under the Mandela magic scenario, the traditional alliance between the ANC and COSATU and the SACP breaks up, largely because of the more business-friendly, market-friendly trajectory that Ramaphosa embarks upon. Despite the fact that he's got a set of golden handcuffs because of the early endorsement of COSATU, and I actually in fact make that point in the book, this contradiction this challenge that he faces, so you're absolutely perfectly right. On the informal economy, we actually, the informal economy is, in South Africa, South Africa's informal economy is smaller than most other countries at comparable levels of income for a variety of reasons. But the informal economy does not translate into sustainable employment. Informal economy employs a lot of people, but they don't pay taxes, and so on and so forth. So generally, traditional economic theory is that the informal economy, it's a stepping stone that may help absorb people, it's a survivalist sector that cannot find jobs in the formal economy, and in that sense it should be encouraged, but it is not a sustainable future growth path. You should be growing the formal economy, because people that are in the formal economy are part of wage negotiations, they get pensions, they get annual waging, and they pay taxes and so on and so forth. So the traditional pathway for economic development is that you start off with a large informal economy, and then that reduces over time as you go up the GDP per capita curve, and productivity in the informal sector, which is often very, very low, changes as countries go up the growth curve. So at high levels of income, the informal economy is much more of a criminal economy as it would be, but much smaller. And there's no productivity differentials between the formal and the informal sector, and so on and so forth. We actually did a modeling of the informal economy for Western Cape government, where we looked in detail at the informal economy, and the result of that was, in the Western Cape, and the result of that was, yes, if nothing else helps, then don't discourage the informal economy, but it's not an alternative. It's a survivalist sector. It's not a vehicle for economic growth, because if you look at the size of the informal sector as size of total GDP, it's relatively small. It provides survival for many South Africans, but yes, that's fine, but it's not a future-oriented growth strategy.
Right. I just want to thank you, Jakkie, for your very inspiring and interesting and complex presentation, and to all of you for your questions. There's some free publications in the back, and then there are some books for sale at the back, and I'm sure Jakkie will be happy to sign the book for you. Thank you very much.